Legion Tacticals are my favorite unit in the Horus Heresy Age of Darkness. In the lore, tactical Marines make up the bulk of the legions, and I like to reflect that in my tabletop armies. For most legions, I include at least one 20 Marine strong tactical squad to hold backfield objectives, along with a few additional squads and rhinos to capture objectives further up the battlefield. In this guide, I'll show you how I batch paint my Imperial Fists Legion tactical squads. Although my example uses a Mark III Marine, these techniques can be applied to other armor marks as well. Games Workshop has done an excellent job with the redesigned Space Marines, giving them a fresh yet familiar look with great upscaling and poses. Here are some tips for assembling these new plastic Marines. Each bolter pairs with a specific pair of arms, as outlined in the assembly instructions, and they are arranged together on the sprues. When clipping the parts off the sprue, keep these matching sets in groups to avoid mixing the parts up. This is especially important with Mark III Marines, whose arm pairings lack the design marks that the Mark VI arms have, which serve as easy indicators to pair the arms in the event they get mixed up. With my hobby knife, I clean off the excess sprue and clean up the mold lines, making sure to keep my parts still in their groups. I then pin drill barrels. Now it's time to glue the bodies together and attach them to their bases. Arm and bolter sets can be freely used with any torso and leg sets, allowing for diverse poses. When gluing the arms on, dry fit the bolters to ensure proper alignment. Do not glue the bolters on. Painting the Marine and bolters separate is easier and cleaner to paint. Glue the shoulder pads and power packs on. The direction the head faces is crucial for the model's overall appearance. I usually orient the head slightly left or right. Pay attention to the alignment of the head with the feet to ensure the model looks balanced and purposeful. Misalignment can result in a Marine that looks awkward or unsteady. I left the helmeted sergeant's head off because we will be painting it red. Alternatively, you could leave it on and paint it red with a brush, but I prefer to do the red with the airbrush. Clip off the Vexilia and Nuncio Vox off the accessory sprue if you choose to use them. There is a little antenna for the Nuncio Vox operator's helmet that often gets overlooked. We will come back to the accessory sprue later when it's time to gear up the Marines when they are closer to being finished. Do note, if doing a Legion tactical support squad, the special weapons are designed to fit with the same arm pairs that the bolters use. So even when doing a tactical support squad, I assemble my Marines by dry fitting bolters and then switch them out for the special weapons as I paint. The Umbra bolters from the Mark VI kit are also interchangeable with the Phobos bolters from the Mark III kit, which is an easy way to differentiate units beyond their squad markings. It's finally time to throw down some paint. I base coat the Marines with Citadel Wraithbone spray. I use Wraithbone over Corax White because it gives a warmer tone to the yellow, which will come later. For the Sergeant's helmet, bolters, and other items which will not be yellow, I base them Citadel Chaos Black spray. When the base coating is dry, I then airbrush the Marines with Vallejo Game Air Sun Yellow. Using Citadel Seraphim Sepia Shade, I give the entire model a wash. The wash gives the yellow an oranger tone and sinks into the joints and crevices, making the model's details pop. Using Citadel Abaddon Black, I paint all of the trim on the Mark III armor. This is the most time-consuming step in painting Mark III. Don't worry if you have a few brush slips. We will clean them up in a later step. Then I switch over to painting the silver metallic areas with Citadel Iron Breaker. I paint the backpack details, cables, armor vents, skulls, ablative guards on the shoulder pads, and other small details that will be silver. Using Citadel Eshin Gray, I do a loose highlight on the black armor trim. It doesn't need to be a super clean edge highlight. Then, using Citadel Xandri Dust, I paint the base layer on the Vexilia Parchment and the skull of the Nuncio Vox. I use Citadel Retributor Armor to paint the gold on the Vexilia and Nuncio Vox. I switch to Citadel Wordbearer's Red and paint the lenses on the Nuncio Vox Operator and the eyes of the Marines. Next, using Citadel Caliban Green, I paint the screens on the Vox Operator's Nuncio Vox and helmet antenna. Then I use Citadel Mephiston Red and paint a small highlight on the eyes and red Vox lenses. I switch to Citadel Warboss Green and do a small highlight on the screens on the Nuncio Vox and Vox Operator's helmet antenna. For the Legion Vexilias, I decided to do the emblem plate in Vallejo Game Sun Yellow. In other Imperial Fist squads, I have done gold, white, and black. Using Citadel Ushabti Bone, I touch up the yellow armor where I had any brush slips from painting the trim. I then do a light sponge weather on the yellow armor. This will give a little texture and mimic light scratches on the armor. Avoid sponging the black trim and silver. Still using Citadel Ushabti Bone, I do a highlight on the Vexilia Parchment and skull on the Nuncio Vox. Using Citadel Nuln Oil, I wash over all of the silver on the Marines and over all of the black trim. The Nuln Oil will seep into the armor cracks around the trim, cleaning up the edges, and also help soften the transition from yellow to black. I then wash the yellow Vexilia emblem plates with Citadel Seraphim Sepia. I switch back to Citadel Ironbreaker and do a light dry brush on the gold on the Vexilias and Nuncio Vox. I use Citadel Abaddon Black and do very light lines to mimic scripture on the Vexilia Parchment. Next, I switch to Citadel White Scar and highlight the Vexilia Parchment and Nuncio Vox skull. I highlight straight over the scripture. The black will show through the white scar. Using Citadel Agrax Earthshade, wash over all of the gold on the Vexilias and Nuncio Vox. Rickland Flesh Shade over the Vexilia Parchment and Nuncio Vox skull. Our Marines are starting to look pretty good. Let's move on to the transfers. The Imperial Fists Legion have a great selection of transfers with a dense sheet from Forge World and plenty of more basic icons included with the new plastic kits. Do note, while many of the Warhammer 40,000 Imperial Fists transfers work for Horus Heresy era Imperial Fists, the Legion and Chapter icon are different. The old Forge World Horus Heresy Black Books are an excellent source to find the meaning of some of the more obscure icons, as well as guides on transfer placement. The old Black Books go a little deeper than the recent Legiones Astartes Imperial Fists section, and I recommend everyone check them out. Because we are painting basic line Marines, we won't be getting too fancy with transfers on them. I start with the Legion icons and some smaller emblems for their breastplates. I dip some of the transfers into water and let them soak. I dab a little bit of water where I want to apply the transfer. Using a brush, I place the transfer onto the shoulder pad, then move to my hobby knife and move the transfer into position. I use the rivets in the shoulder pad trim to center the transfer. I don't worry about flattening the transfer to the contoured shoulder pad. I let it dry semi-affixed. You can see the transfers lifting off the pads. After an hour or so, the transfers will dry. I put a generous amount of Walther's Solvaset on the transfer. I let it soak above and underneath the transfer where it is raised. Be careful not to brush too hard on the transfer as it can tear. The Solvaset will make the transfer snuggle down to the contour of the shoulder pad. After doing the Solvaset, I let everything dry for an hour. If the transfers still have not snuggled tight enough, I apply another round of Solvaset and let it dry. After the Legion emblems are fully dried and set, I move on to the squad emblems. These include the troops icon and squad numbers. I repeat the previous steps on applying transfers. I decided I'm going to make this group a Legion Tactical Support Squad with Flamers, and this group, the first half of a Legion Tactical Squad with regular bolters. All my line Marines are pretty standard with Legion emblems, unit type, squad numeral, and then usually on the chest or right knee I introduce some variation. You can see this Marine has a Legion icon on his right knee. This is squad number 12, and this squad is number 3. I make huge armies with tons of infantry, so squad numerals help me keep my armies organized down to squads. I like knowing that each individual model has a fixed place in an army. It makes my unnamed infantry a bit more personal. Let's get started on the red helmet for our sergeant. Returning to the airbrush, I spray Vallejo Model Air Red RLM 23 over the helmet. Then, I airbrush Vallejo Model Air Red RAL 3000. To make things easier, I painted the neck joint with Iron Breaker before gluing the head onto the body. Next, I use Citadel Celestra Gray to paint the helmet stripe on the face of the helmet. I then go over the stripe with Citadel White Scar. I paint the rest of the helmet using the same steps as we did on the standard Legion Marine trim, finishing with a wash of Citadel Nuln Oil Shade. It's time to do a little more weathering. When applying flat decals to rounded surfaces like shoulder pads, expect one every so often to warp. To fix this, I put a dab of Citadel Iron Breaker over the warped area to simulate a bit of battle damage. I then do a light sponge weather of Iron Breaker over the models. You can go over the black trim when doing this. Try not to overdo your weathering. After all, we are not painting Death Guard. It's time to return to the accessory sprue and kit out our Marines. I clip the top half of the sprue, leaving only one attachment point to the holsters, pouches, and grenades. I clean up the edges with my hobby knife. I prime the entire sprue with Citadel Chaos Black spray paint. Next, using Citadel Caliban Green, I paint the frag grenade bodies. Then, using Citadel Iron Breaker, I paint the frag grenade lugs, safeties, holster, and pouch buckles, and crack grenades. I switch to Citadel Warboss Green and highlight the frag grenade bodies. Next, I use Citadel Eschen Gray and do a loose highlight over all of the holsters and pouches. I wash everything with Citadel Nuln Oil Shade. After everything has fully dried, I clip all of the parts off and with a hobby knife, clean up any excess sprue. I touch up the black holsters and pouches with Citadel Abaddon Black and the silver on the grenades with Citadel Iron Breaker. I then glue holsters onto all the Marines. I give the units a mix of pouches and grenades for variety. Let's paint our flamers and bolters. I paint the silver with Citadel Iron Breaker. This always feels like a tedious and time-consuming process, but it's way worse if you try and paint the weapons pre-glued on the Marines. I then switch to Citadel Retributor armor and paint all of the Aquila charms on the pistol grips of the bolters and flamers. Using Citadel Runelord brass, I paint the trim around the flamers' fuel canisters and the ring around the muzzle. Then I dry brush Citadel Iron Breaker on the gold Aquila charms. Next, I do a loose highlight of Citadel Eschen Gray on the black bolter and flamer bodies. To paint the hands on the weapons, I first paint the hands Citadel Wraithbone, followed by a layer of Vallejo Game Air Sun Yellow. They are the same colors we used on the base yellow on the Marines, but in paint pot form. Now I dry fit all of the weapons to make sure they are paired with the Marines with the corresponding arms. I then glue them all on. After the glue has fully dried, we are going to use our 3 favorite Citadel shade washes. We are going to use Seraphim Sepia on the yellow hands, Agrax Earthshade on the golden Aquila charms, and Nuln Oil over the entirety of the weapons, covering both the black and metallic parts. After the weapons dried, I decided to go back and put some small fist transfers on the flamers. I copied this from the Horus Heresy Black Book. I chose a black fist over yellow because it will contrast more over the silver. It's time to move on to basing. Basing your Space Marines with a plain dirt style is a great choice that enhances the realism and provides a neutral backdrop to make the bright colors of your Marines pop. I'll show you how I base my Marines. Using PVA glue and an old paintbrush, I brush the glue onto the Marine's base. I then dip the base in a fine sand mix. Make sure the sand is fully covering the glue. You can use a finger and wipe off any sand hanging over the lip of the base. I let the bases dry and then paint over the sand with a generous coat of Citadel Dryad bark. I go pretty heavy on the Dryad bark. It will dry down onto the sand and further help fix it onto the base. Next, I dry brush Citadel Mournfang Brown over the sand. Then I do a final dry brush of Citadel Ushabti Bone. Using Reikland Flesh Shade, I do a generous wash. This helps blend the different shades of brown. I paint the rim of the base with Citadel Steel Legion Drab. Usually it takes 2 coats to get even coverage. Using weathering powders, I powder the Marine's lower legs and base. This will give a subtle weathering to the Marine and help ground the model into the sand. I crack out the tester's dull coat and seal all of the models. Our troops are now finished and ready to be deployed to the battlefields of Chthoniya. Thank you for watching if you made it this far, and please stay tuned for our upcoming Siege of Chthoniya campaign series. If there are any models or units you would like to see me paint, please let me know in the comments.